Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see so many people coming out tonight for this lecture, and friends and colleagues and supporters of the Fraser Center. Welcome to this event here at Regis College at the University of Toronto. My name is John Dodosky, and I'm the Scarborough Missions Chair of Interreligious Dialogue here at Regis and the Director of the Monsignor John Mary Fraser Center for Practical Theology. I begin with the University of Toronto land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and Regis College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Recognition of our supporters. The programming offered by the Monsignor John Mary Fraser Center of Practical Theology and the Scarborough Missions Chair of Interreligious Dialogue was made possible through the Scarborough Missions Legacy. Scarborough Missions is a society of apostolic life of Canadian Catholics, priests, and laity, motivated by the Spirit and dedicated to the person, teaching, and mission of Jesus Christ, as expressed in his words, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." The Scarborough Missions Legacy seeks to further its ministry work by providing financial assistance to deserving organizations with like-minded objectives. As a Jesuit institution, the Fraser Center at Regis College also adopts principles of Ignatian spirituality for its wide variety of engagements and programming. We would also like to set an intention of peace in our world and keep in mind specifically the current conflict in the Ukraine and all the suffering resulting from that. We keep them in mind this evening. I would like to introduce the Associate Director of the Fraser Center, Fiona Lee. She works tirelessly in preparing and a lot of the background work and is very reliable. I'm grateful to have her. She's also a doctoral candidate here at TST. And I would also like to introduce Ashley Tran, our technical expert, and she's also an MDiv student here at the college and an aspiring spiritual advisor. While we prefer to meet face-to-face rather than through this Zoom darkly, in the interest of preserving some interaction, we invite your questions to be sent through the comments function on the Zoom. While we may not get to all the questions, we will try to collate and address some of them after the speaker. I'll now introduce our speaker. As many of you know, Regis College and University of St. Michael's College have entered into a federation agreement starting July 1st. It's going to be a phased in process. And so we thought it appropriate, especially to bring our colleague over from St. Mike's, and Darren and I have worked together for years, and it's a pleasure to have him here. Darren Dias is the Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Director of Academic Programs at the Faculty of Theology, University of St. Michael's College. His current research projects look at the interrelationship between theology and colonialism. Darren's recent publications include Paulo Freire and Pope Francis on Dialogue and Anti-Colonial Interpretation, Trinity, Elemental Meaning and Psychic Conversion, a Pastoral Consideration. Thirdly, Interreligious Dialogue as Language Negotiation. He is co-editor of the recent volume, Global Indifference, The Church and Migration, which came out last year at Palgrave Macmillan. Darren is president-elect of the Canadian Theological Society and current vice chair of the Lonergan Research Institute. He has been appointed by the Canadian Catholic Bishops to the joint CCCB Canadian Council of Imams Working Group. Very important work that they're doing. He is also the representative liaison of the Catholic Theological Society of America to the Canadian Catholic Bishops. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Dias.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks to the Fraser Center for the work that you do, the great work that you do, and to Professor John Dudowski, the Scarborough Foreign Missions Chair in Interreligious Dialogue at Regis College, for the invitation to speak, and also a warm thanks to Fiona for her great assistance in organizing the event. I was having technical difficulties, I think, up until 5 minutes before we started, even after all these years of Zoom. And hopefully, Ashley, you won't have to troubleshoot any problems during the talk, but who knows? And thank you all also for who are on this Zoom for joining us this evening. Tonight, I present sort of a work in progress, what I hope will become more of a work that's close to completion during my sabbatical. So I look forward to your feedback. This talk tonight is a smaller part of a new project for me that explores the entanglement of theology and colonialism in Canada. Often the role of the church, and today I'm speaking particularly of the Roman Catholic Church, but it would probably apply to other Christian denominations in Canada, especially the other three implicated in residential schools. Often the role of the church and the theology that shapes it is considered a handmaid to the colonial policies of civilization and assimilation of the Indigenous peoples of the Canadian government. Or else instances of Christian imperialism that aimed to eradicate Indigenous cultures, language, and spiritualities is considered a discrete and unfortunate aspect of the evangelization of Indigenous. For example, in 1991, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, early missionaries to Western Canada and the Northwest USA, who ran up to 57 of the 90 residential schools in Canada, offered, quote, an apology for certain aspects of our presence and ministry, end quote. They go on to say, and I quote, we apologize for the part we played in the cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious imperialism that was part of the mentality with which peoples of Europe first met the Aboriginal peoples. We were naively part of this mentality and were in fact often key players in its implementation. The idea that the church is caught up in a mentality and system not of its own making is echoed in the 2009 apology for the church's involvement in residential schools from the then Bishop of Mackenzie, Fort Smith. In his earnest apology, he writes, as a church, we participated in a system that sought to strip away Aboriginal language and culture. I truly believe that most of the sisters and people that worked in the schools did not know the real agenda of the government policy. In the first official statement of apology from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in 2021, they echo previous sentiments saying, quote, many Catholic religious communities and dioceses participated in this system, the Indian residential school system, which led to the suppression of Indigenous languages, culture, and spirituality. Certainly state policies regarding Indigenous peoples, including the residential schools in Canada, functioned on corporatism, a system where the government delegates some of its functions to churches, and churches provide services and input for government policy and legislation. This was also the case, for instance, with immigration. And I'm not debating the authenticity of these various apologies. However, they reveal a real blind spot. Because while they admit to participation in the state-sponsored settlement and colonization of the land that depended upon the assimilation of First Nations and the destruction of their cultures, they are silent on the problematic nature of Christian missionary evangelization and the theology that supports it. There is an assumption that the evangelizing mission of the church, the conversion of non-Christians, and the establishment and growth of churches is a value, and that the Christian message is neutral or apolitical, but caught up in a sinful system. Christian involvement in the assimilation and civilization of the land is framed as accidental or incidental to authentic evangelization. I argue that the evangelizing mission of the church, as it was expressed here in Canada, is synonymous with colonization and imperialism. In 19th century Canada, but in other places as well, a particularly Christian, and more specifically Roman Catholic way of colonialism is through missionary evangelization. To demonstrate Roman Catholic mission as colonialism internal to the genius of Catholicism, I will trace the history of the Catholic ladder. Now, I was happy many people didn't know what the Catholic ladder was. It's something I stumbled upon in my own research. Catholic ladders are representative charts in graphic form of the Christian vision of the history of humanity and divine interventions in it. The ladders are visual catechisms whose images and symbols were explained orally, usually in local Indigenous languages, by missionaries and then Indigenous lay catechists. The ladders were the very first introduction to the Christian faith aimed at those without any prior knowledge of Christianity, though occasionally used to catechize some Christian communities that had neither a catechist nor resident pastor, often Métis communities. While Catholic missionaries pioneered the use of the ladders as preaching tools, their popularity and perceived effectiveness resulted in Protestant and Orthodox ladders as well. The ladders became the most pervasive catechetical aid in preaching to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And the most popular of these ladders was one produced by the infamous Oblate of Mary Immaculate, Father Albert Lacombe. In focusing on Lacombe's ladder, material culture provides a way for us to reconsider the related categories of religion and theology, especially as they are often considered neutral. As anthropologist Matthew Engelke writes, within Christianity, presence as recognized in a variety of forms becomes the reality through which authority, power, and meaning of God are apprehended. The latter is a form of presence ordered to a particular apprehension of authority, power, and meaning in the evangelization/colonization of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. While the ladders were produced by Christian missionaries, they were also sites of encounter for many Indigenous communities over several generations, and so generative of theology. More than simply communicating basic tenets of the faith, they represent a powerful worldview, and their apprehension shifts in different contexts, as does their authority and meaning. My remarks this evening will be divided into 4 sections. First, I will trace the evolution of the ladder and provide some examples and descriptions. I'll share my screen for those, but I'll also put in the chat the sites because you might want to see them yourself. You know, it's easier on your own screen. So I've put those in the chat for later use. Okay, so as I said, four parts. First, I'll trace the evolution of the ladder and provide some examples and descriptions. And then in a second moment, I'll focus on Lacombe's ladder specifically. Then I will turn to the context in which the ladder functioned. And last, I will return to an analysis of Lacombe's ladder and the question of the relationship of colonialism and evangelization. Okay, sorry, you might not be able to see anything in the chat, so I don't know if Fiona can put what is in the chat to make it public. I think I can't, sorry. Okay. Anyways, you'll see it. Fiona is going to retype it in. Okay, so a history of the ladders, early forms. According to historian Mark Thiel, between 1610 and 1791, Jesuits in Eastern North America drew impromptu pictures in soil, on bark, and on paper, and they regularly distributed instructional aids such as pictures, rosaries, religious medals, and card games to Indigenous peoples. Images often conveyed concepts of heaven, hell, and the last judgment, with sharp contrasts between the outcomes of the saved and the condemned. In 1637, Makea Biticiu, a Montagnais leader, summarized Jesuit Paul Legeune's teaching by sketching the principal points in the ground, pencil in dirt, the creation of the world, the angels and Adam and Eve, the flood, the prophets, and the history of Christianity up to that present time. The use of images accompanied by an oral explanation was not only didactic on the part of the missionary, but also a way of assessing memory and understanding on the part of the auditor. By the 1660s, Jesuits in New France were producing their own catechetical tools using local images instead of using the ones produced in France. Drawing on indigenous forms, Jerome Lallemand describes instructional sticks with different colors symbolizing different things. Black symbolizing indigenous beliefs, white symbolizing Christian prayers, and red for religious observance. But with the suppression of the Jesuits beginning in the 1760s, the production of these materials stopped until they were revived again in Oregon County in the 1840s by François Xavier Blanchette. Upon the request of the Hudson's Bay Company, two missionaries from Quebec, François Xavier Blanchette and Modeste Demers, arrived in Oregon Country in 1838. And that's a large expanse today of British Columbia, Idaho, Oregon, Montana, and Washington states that were under the joint control of Britain and the USA. Through translators, Blanchette began preaching, but realized that his indigenous auditors did not, quote, understand the Christian need for salvation. Borrowing from the local indigenous culture, rich in woodworking of staffs, planks, and totems, Blanchette created what was called the Sahale stick. I don't know if I pronounced that properly, meaning the stick that comes from above, or from God, or from the sky in Chinook. The Sahale stick depicted the history of salvation from creation until the year 1839. It contained 33 marks to represent the centuries before Christ and Christ's life and crucifixion, a further 18 marks with 39 points to represent the year 1839. Starting from the bottom of the stick, Blanchette explained creation, the fall of the angels, the promise of a savior, and the life and death of Christ, and the mission of the apostles. The stick facilitated the memorization of important biblical events in a mere 8 days, and in spite of language diversity. Blanchette appointed one Lacombe catechist and gave him the stick with instructions on its use. In the next few months, Blanchette made several copies of the stick, but soon realized that the stick did not lend itself to visual improvements, flexible use, and vast reproduction. Blanchette's solution came in the form of a chart made with India ink on yellow wrapping paper, glued to a linen background and measuring 182 by 45 centimeters. Surrounding the scene of the crucifixion, 3 crosses. Let me zoom in on that. There are the 3 crosses, sort of in the middle. Centering on the 3 crosses were timeline indicators, and these bars are timeline indicators, and dots are timeline indicators. Blanchette added several pictographs, or 6 circles for the days of creation, 6 for the Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, a book representing the 10 Commandments, a church, another book representing the New Testament here, and a withered branch here, representing the Protestant Reformation. Blanchette's ladder was used throughout Oregon Country and beyond. Due to the high volume of requests, Blanchette asked for its publication through the Archbishop of Quebec, since Oregon Country fell under the jurisdiction of the Archdiocese of Quebec. The ladder was published in 1842 and entitled Échelle chronologique et historique de la religion. The Archbishop of Quebec sent 2,000 copies for Blanchette's use, as well as copies for all the missions on the Red River, so present-day Minnesota, North Dakota, and Western Canada. And over the next 20 years, there were at least 9 versions of Blanchette's ladder in English, as well as French and Spanish editions. What's of note are the various additions, the changes to the ladder that reveal the theological concerns of the time as they evolved. So, for example, the Nisqually edition contains 12 bars depicting the 12 apostles. Let's see if I can find that. The 12 apostles. The first bar representing Peter is twice as long as the 11 others. It also depicts the conversion of England by Augustine of Canterbury. It contains a branch detached from the ladder representing the Reformation that we've seen already, personified by, and now here's the addition, these bars representing Luther, Calvin, and Henry VIII. These additions highlight the role of the Petrine ministry and the need for Anglican England's conversion, as well as a clear statement on the perdition of Protestants. The latter reflects the growing competition between Protestant and Catholic missions in Canada. This marks the beginning of a Catholic triumphalism and a stronger anti-Protestant dimension to the latter. The 1843 edition places the Protestant branch under hell, and it adds 12 heretics, including Arius and Mohammed. It speaks of the four schisms: Donatist, Greek, Western, and English. And in addition to the Luther, Calvin, and Henry VIII, bars were added to represent Bias, Jansen, and Wesley, since Methodists had arrived in Oregon in 1834. 7 bars were added to the history of salvation, representing the 7 Catholic priests who were working in Oregon country at the time. The 1856 edition, in a salvo to intensifying Ultramontanism, the image of the Church of Constantine was replaced by an image of St. Peter's Basilica, and a reference was made to Matthew 16:18, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." The final edition of 5960, the place of the Pope became more important, with a depiction of the chain of popes from Peter to Pius IX, the religious situation of each continent, Catholic or not, a list of countries in union with the Pope, the name of the Pope followed by cardinals, patriarchs, and bishops. Also added were biblical citations to support the mission of the apostles, the authority of the church, the promise of the Spirit, a prayer for Christian unity, which meant to fall under the authority of the Pope, and a reproduction of St. Peter's Basilica. Blanchette's ladder represented the history of salvation as well as the local missionary situation marked by Ultramontanism and Catholic Protestant competition. It depicted a highly structured, hierarchical, and authoritarian theology of church, history, and salvation. In 1843, Pierre Jean de Smet, a Jesuit, published his own ladder called the Indian Symbolic Catechism. De Smet retained Blanchette's basic structure, but added the concept of two roads. Let me see, it's not as obvious in this one. The second road sort of being here. Okay, and in the 2 roads, one leading to heaven, the other to hell. The good road began in the Garden of Eden. The good road began in the Garden of Eden and led straight to, let me see, there's the Garden of Eden here on the bottom, the bottom left, and led straight to Jesus. And the bad road to schism, reformation, and the devil, and hell. To the growing list of schismatics/competitors, de Smet added more recent peoples and movements: George Fox, the Mormons, and founders of the Disciples of Christ. De Smet also highlighted the missionary activity of the Church Universal and local. He marked the arrival of Blanchette and Demers in 1843, as well as his own arrival in 1840. And he recalled the conversion of the Potawatomi nation, the baptism of an indigenous chief, and the baptism of large numbers of indigenous of the Pacific Coast in 1838. The representation of the local missionaries and conversion of the indigenous leadership is important, as the priest and the clerical privileges related to sacred sacramental function soon replaces the authority of local leadership, indigenous leadership, spiritual and political, and profanes that which is not part of the sacramental system of Catholicism. Now, the popularity of the ladders in missionary work, coupled with their strong anti-Protestant aspect, resulted in, you can imagine, the creation of Protestant ladders. Henry H. Spalding, a Presbyterian minister, and his wife Elisa's ladder retained many of the salient features of de Smet's, but with some expected differences. Spalding's 2 ways were explicit. So one way, this narrow way, is the good way, and the wider way is the Catholic way. Spalding, the Protestant way led straight to heaven, that's the narrow path, while the larger, wider Catholic route to hell. Underneath the picture of the crucifixion stood a Catholic priest dressed in black, worshiping an idol at a sacrificial altar. Spalding depicts a man leaving the good way to become a priest, then pope, sword in one hand and flame in the other, with a king and a bishop kissing his feet. The latter also makes allusion to the cult of Mary, anti-popes, and the massacre, as you can see here, of Protestants by Catholics. This brings us to Lacombe's ladder. And this is a bit of a blurry edition, but I'm going to go to one that's a bit clearer in a moment. In 1865, Oblate of Mary Immaculate missionary Albert Lacombe, in the story reminiscent of that of Lejeune a century before, recounts that he was discussing Christian beliefs with two Blackfoot men. He drew symbols in the sand to assist his explanation and noticed immediately how the visual aids assisted their understanding. Lacombe took to paper and ink, and over the course of 8 years transformed the Catholic ladder into what historian Mark Thiel calls a small masterpiece of pedagogy. Now, I'll just say, because of copyright, I have to use what's available for public use. There is a copy of the ROM library, and it measures about 172 by 28 centimeters, and it folds up in about 12. It's quite an exceptional artifact. It starts on the bottom and moves its way up to the top. So this is the bottom here. And as I said, I'll move to a clearer one in a moment. But the clearer one is put side by side, and originally it would have been a ladder from top to bottom. You'll know what I mean in a minute. Lacombe's ladder presented Catholic dogma, morality, and history as clear and uncomplicated concepts that resembled the climbing pole used by some of the native shamans to climb to heaven and return to earth. It was first published in 1872 by the Congregation of Notre Dame under the title Tableau synoptique de la doctrine catholique, mise à la portée des sauvages qui n'ont encore reçu aucune instruction. So it was for those who had no religious instruction. Several thousand more copies were printed worldwide after it was recommended by Pope Pius IX. Another 10,000 copies were printed in Montreal and Paris after it was recommended by Joseph Fabre, the Superior General of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. In 1874, a further 16,000 copies were printed in Paris. Beauchemin et Fils in Montreal continuously published the ladder from 1895 into the 1920s. In 1896, a bilingual edition was printed, but what did not change is the vivid colored imagery introduced by Lacombe. This remained in all the editions. In 1810, Father A.G. Maurice commented that the ladder was, quote, now in universal use in the mission of Canada, of the Canadian West from Lake Superior to the Pacific. Even after 1930, the ladder was printed as far away as Ranchi by Indian Jesuits and as close as the University of Ottawa's Missiology Institute. The Lacombe's ladder developed the two roads introduced by Desmet. Here you can see the two roads. On your left is the good road, light in color, and of course the evil road on the right. The two distinct roads, one is good and one is evil, or to be more blunt, one is Catholic and the other way. Unlike Spalding's ladder, the good road and the road to perdition are equal in size. Indigenous characters are depicted on both roads, some on the road to hell along with pagans and heretics and Protestants, and some on the road to heaven with other Catholics being ushered onto the good road by the figure of the Pope. Now it's blurry here, but there's a figure of the Pope, seated like a final earthly arbiter very near the particular judgment, near the top, just before the final. The good path is dotted with events from the Old Testament, the three virtues and seven sacraments. One finds idolatry, paganism, and the seven capital sins on the evil path. Lacombe's ecclesiology affirms the authority of the Pope, bishops, and priests over the faithful, the poor, and the ignorant. The defining feature of non-Catholics in the latter was disobedience. Protestants refused the authority of the church, and non-Christians ignored the authority of God. So let's turn to Lacombe's ladder in greater detail. This is less blurry, but you can see that. But you can see, and let me just make that smaller. No, there it is. You can see this is now side to side. What would normally would have been one is now shown side to side. Okay, starting here on the bottom. So according to Lacombe, who wrote a bit about this, a very short piece about what he was trying to communicate, the first thing to communicate is the fundamental mystery of the Trinity. Then creation, chaos, good and wicked angels, the 6 days and the Lord's Day, and then the fall, And there we see the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. The promise, immediately we have then the promise of a Redeemer, Mary standing on the serpent holding the infant Jesus, because the missionaries have to communicate the need for salvation and redemption to Indigenous. Then their black bands here represent the 40 centuries before Christ. Human corruption is depicted in images from the Old Testament. Sacrifices, the murder of Abel here, the flood here and the dark waters, the Tower of Babel. And at Babel, we see the dispersal of nations there. And here is where the two roads open up. The good way is marked by monotheism, Abraham, the sacrifice of Jacob, Isaac, and Joshua. That's here. On the right-hand side, we see the devil's way, idolatry, paganism, and the 7 capital sins. And to the left, on the other side, we see Moses and the Decalogue here. Moses and the Decalogue. David, Solomon and the temple, Jeremiah, John the Baptist, the new law, and the 7 virtues and the sacraments. Here, the sacraments are up here. We see on the evil way, the deadly sins are depicted along the road, but there are moments for those on the evil way to take the good road. So we have, for example, at the birth of Jesus now, we have the Magi, the wise men, moving over to the good way. We also see St. Paul preaching to the Gentiles. And we see after the conquest of the Americas, which is on the next page, this side, we see the possibility of Indigenous people going to the good way by conversion. We see the birth of Jesus depicted by 30 red rounds. Sorry, we see the birth of Jesus and then 30 red rounds for the hidden life of Jesus and three square markers for his ministry. The Passion is just depicted, and the 7 sacraments are seen flowing directly out of his side, because a sacramental worldview is very. The sacraments are very important in the Catechism to Indigenous. The 2 nights or the 3 days of the resurrection are depicted with the 2 black dots. The resurrection is depicted in 40 days, and for the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, we see 40 red rounds. And then centuries after Christ, we see other important facts by centuries, and that's on this next page here. We have to start again from the bottom. Okay, and there's the ascension. And we see after the ascension is the church. And then the most important facts by century. Here we see depicted the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And we see the principal heresies that lead people from the good road to the evil way. And we see there Arius, Muhammad, and Luther. That's the 3 here. And we see at the top of this chart, as I pointed out before, an infallible pope that directs and blesses the efforts of the children of the church, while the devil tries to tempt children into the abyss. We see at the top particular judgment, and then images of purgatory, hell, and heaven. Now, the first council of the ecclesial province of Oregon in 1848 was presided by Blanchet himself, who had now become the Archbishop of Oregon City, recognized the value of the latter and recommended its use among the First Nations and settlers of the region. The council remarked, I quote, "It will be profitable if all who are engaged in handing on Christian doctrine, particularly among the Indians, use this symbolic historical chart, which in the year 1839 was contrived by the missionaries of this region as if by divine instinct," compliment to himself, "with a great profit to souls." However, the second council of the province of Oregon in 1881, in a bid for uniformity in the manner of handing on Christian doctrine, recommended the use of Butler's printed catechism, as it had been recently approved for use by the Irish bishops. Butler was to become the standard catechetical tool used for English-speaking Catholics in the ecclesiastical province. Previously, Le Petit Catechisme de Québec, which had been authorized for use in all places under the jurisdiction of the Quebec Archdiocese, including Oregon Country, was used in conjunction with the latter's, as was probably the popular Penny Catechism. But by 1881, a significant shift was taking place in the evangelization and education of Indigenous peoples. In a few decades, both church and state recognized the failure to convince Métis and Indigenous adults to abandon their culture and spirituality, and of their need for Christian salvation. This resulted in missionaries focusing on the young and their education and civilization in industrial and residential schools. With the establishment of residential schools in Canada in 1879, religion was taught by rote, using printed catechisms, thus rendering the latter too rudimentary for now baptized children living in Christian settings, alienated from their Indigenous language, spirituality, ceremonies, objects, and ways of life, and instead imbued with a life of strict prayer, discipline, and Euro-Canadian religious culture. While the latters might have fallen out of favor as catechetical tools of clerical missionaries, they became less itinerant, and with the establishment of industrial and residential schools, both in Canada and the USA, the latters continued to circulate in Indigenous communities and amongst their lay leaders. For example, perhaps the most renowned Indigenous catechist, Nick Black Elk of the Oglala Nation, probably used Lacombe's ladder in his Depression-era ministry. This was a previous Fraser talk given by Professor Michael Stober, and that talk is now available in Theological Studies. In Black Elk Speaks, he describes the two roads of his youth, the red road associated with Christ and the black road of evil doing. To Black Elk, walking the sacred red road was the main action in his vision, which was a quest for holiness that formed his Oglala Christian version of salvation history. But with the establishment of residential schools in Canada, the printed catechisms replaced the latters as primary forms of religious inculcation. Unlike previous generations, many students had already been exposed to Christianity, and the effects of colonization through government policies in Indigenous communities were ensconced. But Lacombe's ladder did not disappear. Instead, it took on another dimension in the context of the school. At the Roman Catholic school in Kamsack, Saskatchewan, Fred Brass recalls a copy of Lacombe's ladder that was displayed in the playroom, saying, quote, "There was a picture of stairs. At the bottom of those stairs was Indian people, and there was fire. And above the stairs, there was Jesus and the angels. And that's what we were told. If we didn't change our ways, that's how we were going to end up. That's a picture that will always stay in my mind," end quote. Another Indigenous residential school survivor, in speaking to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Joseph Martin Larocque from Capel School, speaks about the latter as an aid to frighten children in the schools. He says, I quote, "They scared us, the priests, the nuns, the whole thing. They scared us with dead people and, talking about the devil. And they had this little chart, catechism, where here you're going up this road and the roads are winding and the devil's there with a pitchfork. I was scared for a long time," end quote. Another residential school survivor, Fred Kestabish, who was at school in Amos, Quebec, recalls not really understanding the religious teaching, but certainly remembering Lacombe's ladder. Quote, "There was a big blackboard that says, if you're a good boy, you'll go to heaven. On the other side of the drawing, there's if you commit mortal sins. This is where you're going to go. And then you have Lucifer in hell. And it was said always, always and forever." That's traumatizing for a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old. Anyways, when I left residential school, I knew that if I died, for sure I was going straight to hell because I was disobedient, end quote. Martha Manus remembers the latter being employed in the Roman Catholic school in Cardston. At the front, they had a poster. It was really long, and there was a black, ugly road going down, and there were people in the fire at the bottom, and their hands were raised, and they were stuck. And the priest, he taught religion. He said, if you want to go down this road, you're going to be in there. You're going to go to hell. And then the other road was so beautiful. They had a picture of it. It was going to heaven. There was angels and the Lord and talk. It was so beautiful. You didn't want to go to that other one. I was so terrified of hell, end quote. Lacombe's ladder functioned to scare students in the context of a system that associated salvation with obedience to the hierarchical church and sacramental practices, and damnation with disobedience. Disobedience that merited punishment included speaking one's own language, participating in indigenous ceremonies, or keeping sacred items like totems when all of these were forbidden. Lacombe's ladder became less a means of instructing those without prior knowledge of Catholicism, but a powerful tool to inculcate the need for salvation through fear in the context of isolation from family and community, the violent repression of culture, language, and spiritual practices, and widespread abuse, psychological, physical, and sexual, on the part of teachers and staff in the residential schools. Students lived the terror of the evil road and so looked for ways to be on the good way. Now just turn to some of the historical context. The introduction use of the Catholic ladder in the evangelization in Canada lasted well over 100 years. Seemingly forgotten now, it was a most popular catechetical aid in spite of shifting circumstances. The shift in missionary expansion from itinerant preaching in the early 19th century to the permanent mission station as late as the mid-20th century was very significant. According to Akil Peelman, there was an early period in which itinerant missionary living in close contact with the Indigenous and almost totally dependent on them for transport, food, shelter, practiced a real form of inculturation despite his fixist idea of the church. Then followed a period during which the church was established through the creation of missionary centers with a church, presbytery, convent, residential school, clinic, etc., around the central figure of the priest, who was to become more and more a functionary or administrator. Beyond faith formation, establishing the church for the missionaries meant agriculture, education, morality, and civilization. The earlier itinerant period saw Indigenous leaders such as catechists, like Black Elk, through the use, the Indigenous leaders as catechists, though using the tools provided by missionaries, who resolved to transmit the faith to their communities after the departure of the missionary. There was a sense of agency and active involvement in what was transmitted orally, especially in the absence of static and rote catechisms that would eventually replace the ladders as the method of education. In this period, the agency of Indigenous people was also expressed in another way, that is, the refusal to be converted to Christianity. As reported by a missionary of the Evangelical Mission Society in 1805, Sagoyuwata, chief of the Seneca, said to the missionary, quote, "Brother, we do not understand these things. We are told that your religion, given to your ancestors and transmitted from father to son. We too have a religion which our ancestors received and have handed down to us, their children. Brother, you have now heard our words, and we have nothing more to say for the moment. We are about to depart. We come to shake your hand with a wish that the Great Spirit protect you during your trip and bring you back to your friends without harm." A polite way of saying we're not interested. With the establishment of churches and schools and the legal requirement for Indigenous children to attend these schools, any sense of freedom and agency of the Indigenous parents and children was removed. As the latter demonstrates, in the itinerant period, the purpose of preaching was not ordered to baptism, but conversion. Of course, early missionaries in the region envisioned the eventual entry into the church through sacraments of initiation of those to whom they preached. But normally the missionaries did not seek mass baptisms or the baptism of children unless the parents were also well disposed. In a mid-19th century letter from Modeste Demers, who is now the Bishop of Vancouver Island, to Francois Blanchette, Archbishop of Oregon, Demers laments that one missionary who was so inspired by Francis Xavier baptized and married about 4,000 Indians, quote, 4,000 Indians, without them knowing practically anything, end quote. However, a letter from Blanchette reveals the reasons for the insistence on a gradual introduction into the Catholic faith before baptism. It was less due to respect for the freedom and understanding of the faith of the Indigenous, but on a perceived recalcitrance of Indigenous. According to Blanchette, quote, "Experience has taught us that one should not rely too much on the first appearance of the goodwill on the part of the Indians. Their old habits and their customs of jugglery, medicine, polygamy will be obstacles which will be conquered by the grace of God, but which will retard the progress of the gospel among them. First Nations people were considered intractable and obstinate children, persons hardly to be counted on, irresponsible, with the missionaries and bishops as their chiding parents. In the later phase of permanent settlement, the cultural world of the First Nations had already been destroyed by colonial powers. According to Peelman, Christianity, being presented essentially as a religion of salvation, the missionaries themselves, in those concrete circumstances, appeared as veritable saviors, offering to Indians what was necessary for survival, end quote. The church did not simply glom onto imperialist and colonizing ideologies of the state, as is often presented in such things as ecclesial apologies and responses to residential schools, but was itself imbued in imperialist ideologies of hierarchy, authority, liberation, and salvation. These were inseparable from its theology and praxis. Like the so-called Age of Discovery, the Catholic Counter-Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries, the 19th and 20th century missionary movement was a period of conquest, competition, and subjugation, marked by the expansion of the church into occupied territories outside of Europe. According to historian Robert Choquette, and this is a rather lengthy quote, but it's a good one, they, the two periods, Reformation and missionary period in Canada, were the quintessential product of a new mood in Catholicism, a new militancy, a new urge to conquer the world for Christ and his church. This new Catholic Church included more determined and aggressive popes and bishops, great revitalization or religious reawakening movements in countries like Ireland and Canada, a conservative and reactionary theology, a strong movement for centralization of church power in the Vatican, and a veritable epidemic of vocations to the religious life by women in particular. By the middle of the 19th century, Choquette says, this growing Catholic clerical army understood the world in simple categories. The world and society was the devil's playground. Liberalism was virtue's hearse, and the duty of true Catholics was to become Christ's soldiers, troops dedicated to conquering a world being driven to hell on the accelerating bobsled of Western liberalism and secularism, end quote. Euro-Canadian ultramontanism became the theological linchpin in the assimilation of Indigenous peoples. In their civilizing motivation, the missionaries were no different from traders, merchants, soldiers, or teachers. Missionaries had two motives: to both liberate Indigenous people, ostensibly from themselves, and to quote Choquette, crush Indigenous cultures. Before concluding, just a brief critical analysis of the ladders. Anthropologists Denis Gagnon and Lynn Drapeau argue that the ladders were the result of a métissage of ontologies of presence and not merely a tool for assimilation used by missionaries, since their genesis was drawn from Indigenous practices and they were accompanied by oral transmission in local languages, often by Indigenous catechists. While this may have been true of the ladders briefly in an early period, this is less plausible in the context of residential schools. Achille Peelman argues that while Lacombe and his predecessors may have tried to create something that appealed to the Indigenous imagination by resourcing Indigenous pedagogical methods, quote, Lacombe imposed on the Indigenous a broad theological view stamped with the Catholic ideology of the 19th century, dividing the world into two: the good, or the Catholics, and the bad, all other people. There was the road of the Catholic Church leading straight to God, and there was the road of evil, that of pagans, heretics, and schismatics, which led in the direction of hellfire, end quote. In fact, according to Peelman, Lacombe's ladder actually ran counter to the religious mentality of Indigenous with their unified view of the universe and very deep faith in God the Creator. While the latter shifted away from the dogmatic approach to catechetical instruction espoused by the Council of Trent to a historical viewpoint of salvation history, this history was presented not as real history or events, but an ideological interpretation of history marked by a radical division that was totally foreign to Indigenous, very religious, unified view of the universe. Thus, the theology of the latter is itself an expression of colonial power, drawn from an ideological interpretation of history. In the latter, Indigenous peoples are made descendants of an accursed race. It denies Indigenous peoples relations with the Creator and the value of their own prayer. Prayer in relationship with God is the privilege of white European Christian settlers. Columbus's ship arrives in the dark pagan lands in order to bring the light to get onto the right path. The latter represents what constitutes to this day a theological interpretation of history that is highly disparaging towards the Indigenous religious culture and spirit. According to the latter, the world divided into kingdoms of light and darkness, of non-Western people, right, and Western people. The non-Western people are in danger of eternal perdition. Not only outside the church, no salvation, but outside Western Christian civilization, no survival. The latter attempts to cultivate a desire for salvation that is at the same time a desire for survival. It is an exclusive and pessimistic view of history, where understanding the word of God is reserved to those with imperial power and knowledge, thus sacralizing structures of, to quote Peelman, inequality and injustice, which actually stemmed from colonialism and the exploitation of our planet by the political and economic superpowers, end quote. French missiologist Henri Morier contends that Christianity's affinity to imperialism and colonialism is embedded in its claims around universalism, right? For example, that the gospel should be preached to the whole world and that all nations should become disciples of Christ, universal claim, or that the gospel message can be enculturated in any culture, or that dogmas and sacramental life of Catholicism have universal significance, such as theologies of salvation or the Eucharist. Christianity, Morier argues, is not universal in the sense that any people can adapt to it. It is universal in the manner in which it universalizes itself. The idea that Christianity in general, or Roman Catholicism in particular, can be implanted anywhere and at any time through inculturation of the gospel message is naive and perhaps fallacious. Morier's work with the forest people of Central African Republic demonstrates that their culture and way of life had to change drastically before Christianity could be implanted and grown. Concretely, Morier surmises, quote, the spread of the Christian message has always been realized within a framework of imperialist state expression, with European missionaries imposing, in an aggressive manner, a veritable change of civilization on the quote unquote non-civilized people of other continents. And this is just as true in North America as it is elsewhere, perhaps even more true, end quote. Christianity is developed and expressed in what Morier terms a triad of city, state, empire. This entails the development of techniques to remove the independence and autonomy of peoples in favor of imperial centralization, right? This is, after all, the opposite of Babel. The latter provides a vivid illustration, centralization of civilization in the papacy and the figure of the Pope universally ruling from a throne, right? Empire. The states as patriarchates and episcopal conferences as the state as patriarchates and episcopal conferences, and dioceses as the urban centers. The autonomy of the indigenous family or village or community leader is replaced by the authority of the ministerial priesthood and the sacramental system. As the latter demonstrates, there is no longer need for family or community relations for salvation. Further, supernatural communion is mediated through the sacramental practice at the hands of the clergy. Authority as well is moved from chiefs, local leaders, family, and customs, and instead organized around the descending power from the Pope to the bishops to the priests. The missionaries that are represented in the latter are important because they replace the chiefs, leaders, shamans. Morier writes, quote, to unite vast different populations around complex and unstable dogma, such as Trinity, Christology of Chalcedon, Eucharist, and sacraments at the hands of the ordained clergy, the church had to develop a magisterial organization that had need for a network of developed communication, of teaching, of surveillance, of control. Lacombe's ladder is a vivid example. To conclude, the events and images depicted in Lacombe's ladder represent the reality through which authority, power, and meaning of God were apprehended in the context of the particular colonialism of the 19th and 20th century in Canada. The theological worldview it generates is one of dualism, rigid hierarchy, centralized authority, fierce competition, fear of judgment, and a desire for Christian salvation. The particular and ideological interpretation of human history is conflated with all human history. The radical division between those on the good path, Christians who recognize the authority of the Pope and the sacramental system, and those on the evil path, everybody else who doesn't submit to the authority of the Church, the Catholic Church, expresses imperialism endemic to Christian mission. Lacombe's ladder becomes a tool for theological self-reflection and self-criticism. A critical reading of the ladder in its historical context challenges theological claims that are believed to be universal, but actually universalized particulars. These claims are projected from one era and culture into another that is different because of the belief that the gospel message and Christianity can be enculturated at any time and in any place, and that all must desire Christian salvation. On the one hand, the latter functions on a rigid dualism that racially, culturally, morally, religiously others, and at the same time, it occludes difference in the attempt to make the other into the same, into this universalized Christian salvation. Lacombe's ladder demonstrates a self-generated form of Christian imperialism, not necessarily at the service of state policy, but a particularly Roman Catholic expression that happened to be in lockstep with the agenda of the Canadian state to civilize and assimilate First Nations people. It remains a cautionary artifact about the continued forms of colonial discourse embedded in our theology, and the need for theology not merely to be critical, but deeply self-critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. That was very enlightening, and I really appreciate your filling in a part of a very painful story and a painful history that Canada is reckoning with, the Church is reckoning with, the whole impetus to reconciliation and how that's to be carried out. You've provided a piece, an important piece of the story that needs to be told. And I thank you for that. We do have a question and answer Q&A tab, which is separate from the chat tab. So if you'd like to put forward a question, I'll do my best to get to them. We have one from Professor Reed Laughlin, just comments that the Blanchet ladder looks similar to the wampum treaties in some ways, and the wampum belts, I suspect he's referring to that aesthetic. Is there any historical connection? Was this also an evangelical strategy?
Thanks for the question, Reed. I'm not sure, but I do know that there is the connection there would be in the use of the images and symbols, which was common. So probably used, but in different ways. There's not a lot written on the ladders. Actually, there's a 1965 thesis that's sort of the point of reference, and there's a few other articles, four or five other articles, anthropologists and whatnot. So I haven't come across anything that makes the connection, a historical connection with the wampum treaties. So I don't know, but I can say that certainly the missionaries, the early missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries in the East, and then again, starting in the 1840s, definitely borrowed from what was existing in indigenous cultures. So that's all I can say to that. But I've written it down because I'm going to look it up, and I'll send you an email if I find an answer. Excellent. I don't know if somebody else knows.
While we're thinking about that, I'll move on to Judith Newman's question. Hi, Judith. It's great to see you here. Thank you so much for this interesting lecture. I had not known about these ladders of salvation, whether of Catholics or Protestants, but can understand their power. I can remember as a child picking up an evangelical pamphlet that had such salvation and damnation images in it. And it was very scary, even in a single reading, and it haunted me for a long time. I can quite imagine how traumatizing these ladders would be for Indigenous children and others. My questions: can you imagine a positive and healing role for visual imagery in contemporary Roman Catholic catechism that would respond to the findings of the TRC report? If so, what would be the visual theological metaphors you would include for that purpose that might avoid such representations of history, empire, and coercive universalism?
Thanks for your question, Judith. I'm going to share this screen share in a moment. There was an attempt, and you can see. I don't know. They tried to remake the stick, the Saheli stick, the Catholic ladder, quite recently, and they went through a whole process, keeping in mind some of the things that you were speaking about. Though they wanted to reproduce it. Of course, it was not without controversy. So there it is. If you Google it, you can find the image yourself. But to your question, I think I would say the first thing is I don't know. So yes, I think visual imagery can help in healing. I think it's really an important. It's an important way to think about healing. I don't know what it would look like because I'm not Indigenous, so I don't know what images. I read from the accounts of survivors of residential schools in order to communicate how they experienced the ladder in the schools. I don't know what a healing visualizations or symbolism would be, but I think that there could be. I just don't want to be the one to answer that question. But the last part of your question is really good. I think that, and Peter Bisson has a question in the chat also, I see, around sort of decolonization of Christianity. I think the last part of your question asks the question that I'm sort of after is, how do we decolonize, or how do we think about Christianity in non-imperial ways? I think, at least for Roman Catholicism, we've inherited an ultramontane culture. And so I think we have to look at and revisit a lot of our doctrines and our theologizing that is inherently, that I really think is inherently imperialistic. So I think that's a really big job. And probably we need the assistance of other disciplines like anthropologists and historians. I don't know that theology on its own has the resources to address the types of questions that you're asking. And that is how to avoid, at least in representational form, history, empire, and coercive universalism. I think that's where we need to do a lot of interdisciplinary historical and anthropological work to inform theology. It's probably an inadequate answer, but that's all I think that's all I can think to say right now.
Yeah, so I see that now, Peter Bisson's question in the chat. And you address that to some extent. He's got me thinking about it too. I don't know what would be the most important step to decolonization of Christianity today. Listening.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John. I think probably starting with listening.
The Jesuit from Regis, Fred Crow's got that wonderful article called "The Church's Learner," where he basically says, that we need to teach. Let's see, just scrolling down here. Albert Frolov, one of our PhD students, says, does Bernard Lonergan have anything to contribute to fighting the effects of colonialism? That's a risky answer there.
I think that Lonergan's probably his distinction between classicist culture and historical mindedness would be helpful. And I think, though, that to take historical mindedness really seriously is part of the challenge, though. We can say that we're historically minded, we're attentive to data, but to take history really quite seriously, which we know Lonergan was concerned of. I don't know that Lonergan did it himself that well in all his work, but that distinction, I think, is really important. If we do take history seriously, then I think that we can, I mean, in the context of theology, then I think that we can use that distinction. So, for example, like, can you inculturate the gospel in any time, in any place? Like, if you're actually historically minded, how do you approach that question? So I think that's one effect. That's one thing around Lonergan's work. I think also the two developments. One is actually Bob Doran around psychic conversion, and that's really important for, I think, healing. And John does some work on approaches to others, to alterity. And I think that's important work. So I think not only Lonergan provides some, but in the development sort of on the one end, that is psychic conversion, of Doran, and then Didowski on alterity. I think those are areas that we can develop to think about how we become more anti-colonial.
Yeah, and certainly Lonergan's biases, like we have to look at the biases, and what you're doing is you're having us look at what have been the embedded biases of triumphalism and how that can perpetuate violence. So it's gonna we need to, I've always thought where it's a tendency in Protestantism to sacralize the Bible, there's a tendency in Catholicism to sacralize church structures, and what's needed is a demythologization or a critical appropriation of that. But we don't want to get too far down that path, because you got a number of questions rolling in here. Donna says, I've never understood the hypocrisy and almost psychological disconnect between the abuse perpetuated at the residential schools and the instruction about evil and good and damnation and salvation. How did they rationalize the abuse?
I'm actually not equipped to answer the question. In some ways, abuse is that type of abuse is not, you can't rationalize it.
Right.
I think that I think the system, though, enabled and permitted this type of abuse, and not just physical abuse, psychological abuse. Even look at the effect of the ladder itself. I mean, those children are terrified. Right. That's a form of psychological abuse.
Yeah.
But this is the way to salvation, because you have to, if everybody needs to be saved, you got to get them on that right path, right? That's the presumption.
Right.
So I don't know that it's rationalized. I do think that it's a system that made abuse easy, and not just in terms of the state policies, but also the theology behind it. Also, the missionaries who were staffing those, and this is in all the schools, but we read even in the area that I'm talking about, Blanchette, and many of them are complaining about the quality of missionaries who are sent there. They're not formed. They have no experience. They can't teach. This is not the cream of the crop. So I think you have a bad situation of underfunded, overcrowded, unsanitary schools, staffed by people who are, not by the cream of the crop, let's say, to put it mildly. Some are just deplorable. It makes it, and then state policies and a theology that supports the system.
Right. And certainly the binaries that you demonstrated in those ladders was part of their justification and rationalization. And the theology leads to a distorted praxis.
Right. Because the type of, as you said, the type of biases that they're operating on, such biases, they're probably able to justify what they're doing to some extent. But I think I couldn't answer that because I didn't do enough research on
that. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for the question, Joy. So Brian is asking, within the Catholic Church itself in the 19th century, were there theologians who were critical about the complicity of the mission enterprise with Eurocentric imperialism? Were there thinkers who challenged the theological presuppositions in the ladders? It's a good question.
It is a good question. I think I think probably Brian McDonough is probably the one who should answer that question.
He's the one that answers.
He's the one who asked it, but I think, Brian, you're probably the better off answering it. I have to say, I don't know. But even in the case of Canada, but even let's take the example of, Las Casas in Victoria. Even within the way they rationalize sort of the rights of Indigenous peoples, who challenge the way, the abusive ways of evangelizing, they do it within the Eurocentric Christian framework. So it's like they shouldn't be, you can't abuse people, it's against their rights. But the idea that they should be Christian, but maybe converted gently and convincingly, that's not a question. Mm-hmm. So I think that to challenge so I don't know that there were many. So even people who we would today hold up like a Victoria or Las Casas are still rationalized within the world that's embedded in that type of theology. Mm-hmm. So maybe the question is a bit more of a modern question to ask from our current standpoint. And that's what I try to do. I try to stay away from making those types of judgments from today, because those are really hard to make. That's why I think using the cultural artifact was more productive for me.
Right. And Patricia O'Reilly says, thanks for presenting the history of the ladder, which is new to her. With hindsight, we can see the danger in this teaching. Although we do not use the visual ladder today, is this hierarchical teaching still used? Are we still weaned on white male European theology? Are we still weaning ourselves from it? Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I mean, I think that our theology is, certainly Roman Catholic theology is Eurocentric and male and clerical or religious, although things are slowly changing. Though in many faculties, I belong to a faculty where there are few women still represented. So, and this is 2021. I think that, and I think you're right. If we look at even the teachings of Vatican II, which, there's still the language of universalism. There's still the language of hierarchy. There's still somewhat of a mythology around the sacralization of certain things. So I think, yes, I think there's a lot of work to do. And that's why I ended by saying part of theology's task isn't just to criticize the world, or it's to sort of, and not just to criticize even sort of the church, we do that, but theology has to regain its ability to be self-critical. And I think until we do that, we're sort of in a bit of a trap that's hard to get out of. And that's why I question whether theology has the resources to sort of to think things through differently without the help of the other disciplines. It's a real interdisciplinary enterprise.
If I could just share an anecdote. Back in the day, a young graduate student, master's student in theology, discovered that the Vatican Observatory was in Arizona was on a sacred site for the Apache, and the Apache needed to get a permit in order to have their annual sacred ceremony on that site. So this student wrote Pope John Paul II and said, how would you like it if you had to get a permit to say Mass? I don't believe the student ever got an answer, and the student may or may not be online tonight. Okay. Tasha Tupin, Treaty 4. So I'm going to guess, Tasha, you're coming in from Saskatchewan, God's country. Let me see. I just lost your, okay. One of the comments that I've heard from survivors of Indian residential schools is that colonization has robbed both settlers and indigenous from a rich deepening or spiritual engagement. It seems to me that there is a strong echo of or reiteration of this dualistic, militant, spiritual warfare kind of rhetoric today. Can you imagine any tools or ways to help redress our understanding of our faith in a decolonized way? So now people are looking for resources and ideas.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as I said, I don't want to. My perspectives as a Roman Catholic theologian who I'm also, participate in the clerical life of the church. And so I don't want to suggest answers that should come from indigenous people and from survivors. So I think, as John had said, the first tool is to listen as individual Christians, but also to how do we become sort of a listening church where like hierarchy isn't the thing that is important, but listening to others as equals is important. So I think the first thing is to listen. So when First Nations, well, both the TRC, but then also First Nations ask, and I think quite legitimately, because we see the role that the Pope played, at least the image of the Pope played in the colonization. When they ask for an apology from the Pope, this is worth listening to. It's not, you don't dismiss it, right? So there are in the TRC, there are several recommendations that have been echoed by Indigenous peoples. And so we have to take the first steps, or we have to continue to take the steps as settlers to address these things. Now how we do that differs from place to place. But I do think that the table is set, and both the state and the church is very slow to react. The discovery of the of graves, this wasn't a surprise. It's in the report. That was issued years ago, and neither government nor church acted on it. Now, the First Nations communities themselves did it and uncovered the graves. So, I don't think it's that. I think if we start with looking at taking the recommendations really seriously, then the tools and whatnot will sort of uncover themselves. As long as we ignore them, that document that we've agreed is the way forward for reconciliation, then we don't move anywhere. So I think for now, I would say, and that's not to say it's the end of the way we build relationships as settlers with Indigenous, but let's take the TRC recommendations really, really seriously as a church. And let's also ask our politicians to take it really seriously, because certainly none of those recommendations were part of were major issues of the last federal election. So I think that's
we're getting a lot more questions that we'll probably be able to answer, but I want to jump ahead to Michelle Andreas's question. Michelle is a professor, if he doesn't mind me saying, at St. Paul's in Ottawa. And I like his question because he's keeping us honest here. He says, are our schools of theology functioning outside the colonial paradigm? Great question.
This is another question that Michelle is probably.
Regis College is, Michelle. St. Michael's isn't. No, just kidding.
Well, I think this is, this is another one, Michelle, you would be the person to ask. I would say, I don't know if John or Fiona, anyone would agree. I would say no. I would say no. Even the post-Vatican II theological paradigm, it's just the translation of the curriculum from Latin into English. Like, we're still functioning in a certain paradigm. We still have the sort of the same divisions in theology and systematics, etc. Secondly, I think that, and I think there's something about the curriculum that we need to revisit in order to be not just outside of the paradigm, but sort of anti-colonial. At the same time, as we move towards becoming more like a modern university, I think we ask the question, like, how does the university function outside of the colonial paradigm? I mean, just the very idea of epistemology and the transmission of knowledge and what constitutes knowledge. I mean, I think if you really were to take functioning out of the colonial paradigm seriously, I'm not even sure how we would function as a university or faculties of theology. So I think we remain deeply embedded in the colonial paradigm, so deeply embedded that I don't know what it would even look like to be outside of it. I mean, I think I would like to imagine it, and I'm sure there's people who are thinking of ways to imagine it, but I don't know what it would look like. As certainly as a Roman Catholic theological faculty, I don't know.
Well, I would just, I had the privilege of taking a course from Cyprian Davis, who wrote the history of Black US Catholics. And he told us that racism is like radiation. And I think the same thing applies to the colonial paradigm. There's probably parts of the church that's toxically colonial and parts that's less toxic. And there's probably a certain amount of that attitude in the air that we may not be able to eradicate, but what we want to avoid and what we want to heal are the toxic aspects of it. That's just kind of an off-the-cuff comment there. I want to take a question here from Sean Foley. I see he's online. Hi, Sean. If we make it into the press, be good to us now. How do you think a reappropriation of Scripture in the person of Christ, who lived under imperial rule and demanded institutional change of the existing religious structures, helped the church itself undergo the conversion necessary to do the big job of decolonizing Christianity and reconceiving itself?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm very fortunate. In the office beside me, my colleague Colleen Shantz put me onto a resource. Well, because of the work that she does, she put me onto a resource, a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, which I use, and it's sort of an anti-imperial commentary written by Warren Carter. And your question reminds me of how Carter sort of comments on the Gospel of Matthew. I think you're right. I think looking at the person of Jesus, who lived in the Roman imperial situation, could change things, could change the religious structures. I think looking at a certain interpretation, an anti-colonial interpretation of certainly the synoptics, maybe John too, is work that would be very welcome. I don't know that a lot of it is being done, but some of it is being done. When I read Carter and situated Jesus as somebody who lives in an occupied land and whose the notion of kingdom and reign are sort of counterbalances to the reign of Rome, to the empire of Rome, and to see occupation of the land, of Galilee by the Roman army, like this breathes new life, I think, for me into understanding Jesus as a colonized person who is fighting really to maintain some sort of let me just say, so that Jesus as a person in an occupied who's experienced colonialism, right? So I do think that would be a great resource. I think that would be a great resource, is to go back to the sources, but not just to go back to the sources and do philology, but to read it as post-colonial narrative. And so I think that would be a good tool. And just like I saw in the chat that Brian McDonough suggests, another good tool is to think about your own family's history of settlement in Canada, or your own history of settlement in Canada, and how that implicates you in the colonial narrative, certainly the colonial narrative, and as Christians or Catholics in the ecclesial colonial narrative.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the question.
Great question.
We have, I'll just read a comment and then we'll have time for one more question. Christine Jameson, hi Christine, it's great to see you here. She says, I strongly recommend Alan Jorgensen's book, Indigenous and Christian Perspectives in Dialogue. This is an important book that is in dialogue between Indigenous perspectives and Christian perspectives without collapsing these voices. Thank you for that, because I'm going to look at that in advance of my course on faith and culture this fall. And Alan's a great guy. I think he's a TST graduate, if I recall correctly. And finally, we got to mentor our doctoral students here. Patrick Nolan has a question. He says, thanks for the insights, Darren. What would you say to the demythologizing of the romanticized notion of the penitent disciple? It seems that a potential rationalization of abuse may have been that we are to suffer like our Savior. What may be a helpful method of challenging key notions is the case Christian spirituality, while also recognizing their fruitful contributions to the tradition. What does self-critical mean in spiritual or theological proclamations that seem so enshrined, biblically inspired? Yes, if you're into self-destructiveness, there's plenty of a lot of the stuff can be co-opted that way. Patrick and Darren, over to you. That's a pretty complex question.
It's a long question. I'm just rereading it.
These doctoral students, and they lead with the heavy questions here.
I mean, I suppose I look at your question, I'd say like, I think it might seem biblically inspired, and it might seem that it's so deeply embedded, right, in our theological doctrines. But I don't think that means we don't revisit them. I don't think that means we don't revisit them. And not just in terms of what the doctrines might mean today, but revisiting the doctrines themselves and how they developed and how they function. So I'm just trying to find your question here. No, it's the wrong one. So I think we take we privilege anti-colonial reading strategies when we look at scripture or doctrine. And I think that helps us to be self-critical. And self-critical of theology, because theology is, as I said, I think it's often portrayed as some kind of neutral endeavor where, you trace historically what happened biblically, and then in the first 3 centuries, and, the councils, and then what theologians said about the dogmatic definitions, and it's like a vacuum, right? That it seems that it's not sort of embedded in social and political movements, or that it is somehow co-opted, from time to time by these movements, instead of actually being productive of the theologies that are harmful. Like, theology can produce theology that's harmful to people. Mm-hmm. And that makes us uncomfortable. But I think it's true. And that's the level of self-awareness and self-critique, I think, that is called for in the wake of things like the clerical sexual abuse scandal, or in this case, the sort of Catholic imperialism in Canada. Mm-hmm. And it might be a cautionary tale to look at theology that continues to do harm to people. And that theology also is out there. And sometimes even sanctioned by the church.
Yeah, change is painful. And Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, the church is always reforming itself. And the reforms, we may not be done with the reforms. Certainly we're not, but there may be some a Vatican III on the horizon. We're getting close to 8:30. I don't know about you all, but I go to bed at 9, so I'm getting boring in my old age. But I want to thank Darren. I want to thank you all for coming out and having such an interesting discussion. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, and there's some great comments in here. We will be putting this up online within the next couple of weeks. So if you know people that missed it, we will be working on our programming for next year and getting some First Nation voices in as well in some of our programming, and liaising with other wonderful centers in the Toronto area, and hopefully even across Canada. So this is something that the Canada and the church is going to be working on for a very long time. So I thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you again, Darren, for your very stimulating presentation. And everybody stay safe, and let's continue to intend and pray for peace in the Ukraine. Thank you. Or Ukraine, sorry. Thank you.